Hello everyone, this is Juxtaposition and today's video is going to be John F. Kennedy Part 2 in terms of the hub and spoke model that I'm using. I'm not going to talk that much about John Kennedy. I'm going to talk about Fidel Castro, Richard Nixon. I'm going to talk about H.W. Bush, George H.W. Bush from Skull and Bones and Yale. Not too much on him, but because he's just an odious person. I'm going to talk about Jose Menendez. I'm going to talk about Jose Perdomo. I'm going to talk about Jeff Bezos' adopted father, Miguel Bezos from Santiago, Cuba. I'm going to connect some dots here regarding Operation Zapata, which also happens to be a corporation that George H.W. Bush owns, Zapata Oil. Which is a CIA front company for espionage and spook-like activities that was going on in the late 1950s into the 1960s. I believe Zapata Oil had an office at the John Kennedy murder scene in the Daltex building on the second floor. And we have photographs of what appears to be George Bush standing in front of the Texas School Book Depository there at the corner of Houston and Elm Street, just 100 yards from where Jack Kennedy had his brains separated from his skull as the limousine parked as if it were going to have a picnic in Daley Plaza. The kill shot coming from the train trestle triple underpass directly in front of John Kennedy. Now you could say it was a little bit to the north, so it might have been a slight angle into his right eye socket. That is where the shooter was aiming to kill Jack Kennedy, was his right eyeball. And I believe the bullet hit on the perimeter of the eye socket and blew out the back of his skull. That's what I believe is what happened. That is not depicted clearly on the so-called Zapruder film, and you're not going to see an accurate portrayal, depiction of what happened because that's top secret, right? So you can forget all about the Zapruder film, and please do forget about the Oliver Silverstein Stone dramatization of what did not happen that day. I mean, yeah, it's like, 10% true, but the angle is wrong. They want you to emphasize that picket fence. They want you to think in terms of an elaborate conspiracy. There was an elaborate murder plot. I don't think it's as complicated as people tend to give it credit to. It's actually very straightforward and simple. But yeah, there's probably 200 people involved in the dynamics of it because you had to control the murder scene and make sure there were as few of witnesses as possible. And look, if they wanted to kill the president with lots of witnesses, they would have done it at Neiman Marcus on Main Street. All you got to do is just have the Pepsi-Cola bus, which was in front of the president's car and somehow magically ended up behind the president's car in the motorcade. You'll notice that the John Kennedy car was the number 2 car. It was the car immediately behind the scout car when they turned onto Houston Street. That's completely inappropriate. The John Kennedy car should have been much further back in the cavalcade of characters on that so-called motorcade. He was actually the number 2 car, and he was the number 1 car once the sheriff and the chief of police of Dallas, Texas, hit the throttle when they turned onto Elm Street and got the heck out of there, leaving behind Jack Kennedy to his fate. Thank you, William Gere, the driver of the limo, and Roy Kellerman riding shotgun to make damn sure Jack Kennedy was killed. Both Roy Kellerman and William Gere had holsters with pistols, so I'm sure they were ordered that if for some reason the rifle snipers could not blow Jack Kennedy's head off, that they should do that. Anyway, they didn't need to do it because it was taken care of by the railroad trestle. Remember, there was a shot that went into Jack Kennedy's throat, all right? And then there was a shot that went onto his right eyeball socket, right on the perimeter of his right eyeball socket. So that's 2. And as far as whether there were other bullets, there were other bullets. The other bullets are to confuse and create chaos. There were bullets from behind, there were bullets from the side, but that's not the kill shot. That's not what killed Jack Kennedy. The bullet that killed Jack Kennedy came from the triple underpass railroad tracks where there is nobody standing. That's not a pedestrian walkway, okay? That's where the killers were. The killers and the kill team. Remember, it's Operation Gladio is 3 teams of 3, so it's probably 9 men on the train trestle, and that would be 3 shooters armed with high-powered rifles. You should know that it's a very short distance, so you don't need a high-powered rifle to do the kill shot. However, I'm sure they did have state-of-the-art equipment. You should know that it's called the triple underpass because there are 3 roads that go underneath it. So to the north you have Elm Street. That's the street where Jack Kennedy's limousine parked so that he could be killed. Then the center street is Main Street. So you have Elm Street, Main Street, and then the southern underpass tunnel is Commerce Street. Those are the 3 streets to create the triple underpass railroad trestle. Then another couple hundred yards to the west is the Stemmons Freeway for automobiles. I think a lot of people are confused that they think that there was automobile traffic at the triple underpass where Jack Kennedy's kill shot came from. That's not true. There were virtually no witnesses along the railroad train tracks at 12:30 p.m. on Friday, November 22nd, 1963. So it's a real easy peasy kill shot, and not portrayed in the Oliver Stone movie, and not portrayed really in any of the books that have been published regarding JFK. You have to come to this channel right here. And you know, I do consider that my resolution and reconciliation of the Sharon Tate, Abigail Folger, Lino LaBianca, NATO murders really cracked the case and shows my acumen, because there is not a single person anywhere in the social media stratosphere, military complex of internet. There's no books out there about NATO Gladio forces in play in Benedict Canyon and over in Griffith Park, over there in Los Filos. It's called the Silver Lake District, if you want to be technically correct. That's where Walt Disney and Roy Disney established Disney Brothers Studios, and then what became the Disney Corporation was established in the neighborhood where Lino LaBianca was stabbed 10 times to his chest by a military M7 NATO bayonet in his mother's home, where he had 6 guns. I'm sure they were loaded. So Lino LaBianca had to have been chloroformed or stun gun pacified. He's not going to sit on the couch while you stab him 10 times with a bayonet. He did have his hands and wrists tied behind his back with a 43-inch leather ligature, which comes standard with the NATO M7 bayonet holster. It comes with a 43-inch leatherette. And so if you're going to have a hoax murder, don't be bringing M7 bayonet kits with you, which is what the killers did. And they left that behind. So that's an F-up, as John Kennedy would say. You know, John Kennedy had 2 PT boats that he was assigned. PT-109 that we've all heard so much about because it was memorialized in the film with Cliff Robertson, who also appeared in 3 Days of the Condor with John Houseman and Robert Redford, where they tried to float the boat idea that there's a CIA rogue element within the CIA. It's complete poppycock. Okay, CIA has centralized control, military compartmentalization, units and divisions, and there are no rogue elements within it, nor would they have any bank cooperation if there were. So, nice try. I'm not falling for the potato in my tailpipe mendacities, but Jack Kennedy had PT-59 after they got through with the debacle of PT-109. Joseph Kennedy Sr. wanted to get a Silver Star awarded for his son in his PT-109 incident, and that never happened. I think the Navy felt that Jack Kennedy didn't follow procedures on that and should never have been T-boned by a Japanese destroyer near the Solomon Islands. you should know that the PT-109 incident was about a 3.5-day affair. A lot of people think maybe it was longer than that. It wasn't. Trying to see here. Anyway, it was a traumatic situation. There were 2 men that were killed on impact with the Japanese, I believe it was a destroyer. It's a supply ship chain that had a convoy of destroyers with it. And it was at nighttime, it was dark. And he was given PT-59 after PT-109. And then he was sent home. He always had back problems after that, which is understandable. And anyway, I can't find my notes on the number of days that it took before Jack Kennedy and his crew were rescued. And it was about 3.5 days that he had to find refuge in a local island. All right, what I wanted to tell you that I think maybe was glossed over in my last video, part 1 of JFK, was Cuba is CIA-controlled, United States Navy, United States Marines, secured in a 360-degree pattern, much in the way that Abigail Folger was bayoneted in a 360-degree pattern. That's how we know that Abigail Folger had a minimum of 3 trained bayonet soldiers murder her, because if it was just one person like Charlie Watson, give me a break, age 23 with a bum knee, or the petite 5'2.5" Patricia Krenwinkel, armed with a kitchen knife or a buck knife, then the stab wounds would have been in 1 or 2 different angles, but not 360 degrees, okay? And you have to be surrounded, and every move you make, you get poked. So that's military. That's a military crime scene. That's exactly the way it was for her control agent, Wojtek Frykowski, age 32, who was fighting for his life. He was bayoneted 51 times, if you're interested. He was shot twice with an M16 rifle. So this completely disqualifies the idiotic, story that some hippies came on this CIA-controlled property. I mean, you have to be pretty stupid to believe that story, that they walked up the driveway and disabled the gate, climbing up the telephone pole with a bum knee, which got him out of the draft, by the way. You know that Charlie Manson was going to be conscripted. Charlie Watson. That's part of the confusion of this stupid case. They have people with the same names. They do it on every one of these. They did it with the Bay of Pigs. They did it with Watergate. They did it with the Sharon Tate murder. They have the judge's name, Charles Older. Charles Manson, his real name is Miles Maddox, but they call him Manson, and he goes by Charlie, but they call him Charles Manson. They got Charlie Watson, who went by Charlie, but then they call him Tex. That nobody called him Tex in real life. His best friend didn't call him Tex. From Texas, they didn't call him Tex. So they call him that for television. They do that on purpose. Absolutely. Because they're telling you a story. Erin Valente, cued us in on October 7th, 2019, after she met with a Jewish banker at 2500 Sand Hill Road at KKR Excel. She told her mother, it's all a game, it's a thought experiment, we're in the Matrix. And when you're in the Matrix, a lot of people have the same name. Charlie, William, Billy, Jose. We have a lot of Jose's in this story. All right, let's review. So Fidel Castro was Jesuit Catholic raised. He was indoctrinated in Santiago, Cuba as a little boy. He was indoctrinated at 2 Jesuit schools, the La Salle boarding school, where he didn't stay with his parents. He stayed overnight with the Jesuit priests at the La Salle boarding school in Santiago, Cuba. He then, in high school, went to the Dolores School, another Jesuit school, sort of like St. Ignatius High School is to the St. Ignatius Parish near University of San Francisco, Haight-Ashbury. Anyway, so that's 2 schools. Then Fidel Castro, who, by the way, let's say his real name, shall we? It's Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz. It's Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz. Anyway, then he goes to Havana, where remember the Maine and to hell with Spain back in February? 1898, where we sank a United States battleship, the USS Maine, sunk in the harbor, killing 268 Navy sailors, right? And then we established a beachhead there at Guantanamo Bay. Oh yeah, that's a OSS Navy Intelligence Cuba, from Havana to Guantanamo Bay to 360 degrees around that island. So I'm believing that that ship was mined by, clandestine soldiers. Nothing to do with Cubans, nothing to do with Spanish soldiers. No, that's just a mendacity. So then, of course, Fidel Castro goes on to lead the guerrilla movement to overthrow General Batista, who was installed by, I guess, the CIA. Except that they forget to mention that Fidel Castro's army was trained with Frank Sturgis, who's an Italian from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. His real name is Frank Finarini, Frank Angelo Finarini. And he works for the CIA. He was in the United States Marines. And he works closely with Fidel Castro and his brother, Raul. You should know in all these stories, everyone's got a brother. The DM brothers, one was in charge of the CIA army in Saigon. The other one was the prime minister of the fake country of South Vietnam. That's two brothers, okay? And in the Cuban story, it's Fidel Castro and his brother Raul. Neither one was assassinated at all. So, these are the big communists that are 60 miles off our border, and they weren't assassinated, okay? And then you have the Kennedys. You have Joe Kennedy Sr., then you have Joe Kennedy Jr., who's killed in a mysterious British intelligence bomber crash over the English Channel during World War II. That's why we have Jack Kennedy, because, see, it would have been Joseph Kennedy Jr. who would have run for president, but he died in World War II. Jack Kennedy came close to dying, but he didn't die. And so we have John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, both of whom got assassinated by CIA clandestine soldiers. Robert Kennedy was killed by Lockheed Martin Skunk Works employee, Skunk Works being a very high security division of Lockheed, Thane Eugene Caesar, a Filipino man. He's the one that did the kill shot into behind the right ear of Robert Kennedy at the Ambassador Hotel a little after midnight on June 5th, 1968. Robert Kennedy did not die until 27 hours later, around 2 o'clock in the morning on June 6th, Robert Kennedy's heart stopped beating. But for all intensive purposes, he was killed, by 12:15 a.m. on June 5th, 1968. But anyway, so you have the two Kennedy brothers, you have the two Fidel Castro and Raul Castro Ruz brothers, you have the Diem brothers in Vietnam, Saigon. Those are three sets. That's six brothers in clandestine service stories. We have Jose Perdomo, who was in Havana, Cuba, and was a police chief in his early 20s, mid-20s, in around Havana, Cuba. And he goes on to kill John Lennon at the Dakota on December 8th, 1980. There were two doormen present when Yoko Ono, who comes from nobility in Japanese royalty nobility class, in case you didn't know, from samurai backgrounds. So Yoko Ono is not who you think she is. She's very up there. Her father was an elite private banker who spent his time in Hanoi before World War II. He worked in Hanoi, he worked in Tokyo, he worked in San Francisco, and of course he worked in Manhattan, New York, in elite banking. Her father, Yoko Ono's father. And so they're part of the clandestine services. Anyway, when Yoko Ono and John Lennon returned back to the Dakota, which is a CIA complex, in case you didn't know, CIA housing, just like Benedict Canyon, just like Holmby Hills, just like the Malibu Gated Colony, just like Hidden Hills, just like Laurel Canyon was to the music industry, just like Bel Air is, just like Atherton is to the private bankers who think they're free, but in fact they're fried. Just like the Stanford campus, Leland, Stanford Junior University, that's a CIA-controlled colony. Just like the neighborhoods over by Stanford Research Institute are in Menlo Park, you know, where Google was found, where the CEO of YouTube grew up over there, where her father, you know, let some boys use the garage, one of whom married one of his other daughters, Anne. Yeah, that's a control area over there by off Middleton Road. All right, so Fidel Castro travels to New York City after he takes the oath of office as Prime Minister of Cuba, right? Let's discuss this. This is just too hilarious. Remember what Aaron Valente said? It's all a game. It's a thought experiment. We're in the Matrix. So here's the deal. You know, Fidel Castro took the oath of office in February 1959. And that was on the 16th, February 16th, 1959. Then on April 15th, 1959, tax filing date, he visits New York City. All right? On April 15th, 1959. It's 2 months after he becomes the new leader by revolution, by violent revolution, with soldiers trained by the CIA in Guatemala. He boots out General Batista, who is not killed. All right? And that all happens around New Year's Eve, 1958. Anyway, so during Fidel Castro's stay in New York City, you will not be surprised, or perhaps you will, that he placed a wreath on General George Washington's grave. Fidel Castro toured the Bronx Zoo. He ate hot dogs and hamburgers at the Yankee Stadium. He generally made quite a media splash because, you know, the media was assigned to cover this, right? Fidel Castro was 33 years old. He was wearing his beard, and he wore his trademark rumpled green fatigues as the leader of the guerrillas trained by the CIA. President Dwight Eisenhower, you know, went golfing and didn't want to meet with him. Now, bear in mind, that's kind of a mendacity because Fidel Castro was in the United States for 11 days, so there were plenty of times to meet with him. Richard Nixon, vice president under Dwight Eisenhower, did meet with Fidel Castro for 3 hours on a Sunday afternoon. I'll be real specific. April 19th, 1959, Tricky Dick met with Fidel Castro for 3 hours in New York. And you should also know that John Foster Dulles, who's an alumni at Princeton University, he was the Secretary of State, right? Except he was dying from colon cancer. So he's recovering from colon surgery. So he's not really available. So he sends instead Christian Herter, who's the acting Secretary of State for the United States. And he visits with Fidel Castro in New York. All right? Fidel Castro also delivered a speech in New York City to the Council on Foreign Relations. Gee, the CFR, what a shock that is, right? He said he wouldn't beg the United States for economic assistance. Yeah, except they got economic assistance after that Operation Zapata, Bay of Pigs. Bay of Pigs was called by the CIA as Operation Zapata, the same name that the company that George H.W. Bush incorporated with some CIA spook partners. Yeah, they called it Zapata. That's what Bay of Pigs was, which was never intended to oust Fidel Castro. It was to test the new president, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, to see if they could boss him around. And it turns out that no, they couldn't boss him around, even though he was only 43 years old. All these 60-something bullies, Alan Dulles, Curtis LeMay, Edward Lansdale, all these sissy chicken hawks could not boss around PT-109's skipper, John Kennedy. Anyway, I thought you'd get a kick that Fidel Castro spent 11 days in New York City and nobody said anything negative about it. And he can come and go. His passport gets stamped. There's no one shoots his plane down. And he lives to age 90, and he never gets assassinated. You mean to tell me that you can assassinate Sharon Tate, Abigail Folger, you can kill a military policeman, Lino LaBianca, you can kill Dr. Oda and his entire family in Soquel, Santa Cruz, you can kill George Moscone, you can kill Harvey Milk, you can kill Jim Jones, you can torpedo Richard Nixon with Watergate using Frank Sturgis as one of the burglars, and you can't assassinate Fidel Castro. And the answer is to that vexing question is that Fidel Castro was following his orders from the clandestine services, and we follow orders or people die. So long as you follow orders, you're not going to die. And I think the other people were not following orders, and that's why they died. So Jim Jones, Huey Newton, Jeff Bezos' adopted stepfather, Miguel Bezos, they all came and went from Havana, Cuba, no problem. Made it over to Miami anytime they wanted. That includes Jose Menendez, who left Havana in 1959, 1960, and then worked for the CIA throughout the rest of his short life until he was murdered at age 45 in Beverly Hills 90210 in a home that he did not live in. You should know that Jose Menendez was awarded a scholarship to the University of Illinois, Carbondale, within 18 months of his fleeing Fidel Castro. He then has an athletic scholarship to the University of Illinois, which he snubbed and went on to Queens College in New York, where he got an accounting degree and a CPA license and worked for Price Waterhouse, world-class accounting firm. Then he worked for a container intermodal company. Then he became chief financial officer of Hertz Rent-A-Car. And then he became a chief operating officer for RCA, and RCA Victor Music, where he got into the porn business. Then he worked for Carolco Pictures as CEO and chairman of the board of Live Entertainment. RCA is important because you remember that that's who put together Joe Kennedy Sr. with the Jewish boys to create RKO Radio Pictures in 1928. When John Kennedy was 11 years old, his father formed a partnership with at least 4 Jewish men, and it was headed up by member David Sarnoff, who was executive for RCA. Well, that's where Jose Menendez worked as a chief operating officer. He was a top big shot, in his late 30s for RCA, just like David Sarnoff was, who partnered with Joe P. Kennedy. And they built the Cielo murder scene, which is about 14 to 15 acres of property when you add in the perimeter homes that were eventually constructed during the 1940s and 1950s, where Sharon Tate was murdered. That was all taken care of by RCA, RKO Radio Pictures. And that was when, Jack Kennedy was 24 years old. When Guantanamo Bay was being fully developed and Benedict Canyon was being fully developed as military complexes, which would be 1940, 41, 42, 43, 44, Benedict Canyon and Guantanamo Bay complexes were simultaneously being built out for nefarious activities. And to be real specific on Guantanamo Bay, July 12, 1940, the United States Navy signed a contract with Frederick Snare Corporation to expand the Guantanamo Bay complex in Cuba. That's before Pearl Harbor. That's 18 months before Pearl Harbor. And Guantanamo Bay was completed on April 1st, 1941. Before Pearl Harbor, it was fully operational as a United States Marine and Navy base of operations. So I don't want to hear any more fake stories about Fidel Castro, evil communist, when his army is trained by the CIA and Frank Sturgis in Guatemala, and then they overthrow, magically, General Batista, who also works for the CIA. Then we have the 1,200 renegade Cuban exiles trained in Miami Lakes, West Miami, Florida, by the CIA. and they're going to go invade the Fidel Castro CIA trained divisions and units. And of course, it doesn't work, and it fizzles out within 24 hours. There's maybe a dozen people killed. It was like no fuss, no muss. So it was a fake psyops. All right, then I wanted to shift gears here and tell you that when you look at Harvard University, Stanford University, or Princeton, they'll tell you about notable people who attended their school. They sort of portray it as if they graduated. Most of the people on the list did not graduate, but you should know that Harvard and Princeton were home to our enemy, okay? So, and let's get MIT involved too. Benjamin Netanyahu graduated from MIT. Where Sam Bankman-Fried graduated, where Doug Leone got an MBA from the Sloan School of Business at MIT. Yeah, I consider those people enemies of the people. Benjamin Netanyahu, okay, who is not a Holocaust survivor. He wasn't even born. He hadn't been born when the Holocaust happened. I love it when you're a Holocaust survivor and you weren't alive when the Holocaust happened. That's great. But you should know, I'm sure you've heard of Admiral Yamamoto, right? He was the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet for the Japanese Imperial Navy. He was a Marshal Admiral. And his real name, of course, is different. His real name is Isoroku Takano. That's the name of his father. Isoroku is Japanese for 56. In other words, his father was 56 years old when he sired Admiral Yamamoto. Anyway, Isoroku Takano, he attended Harvard University for 4 years, 1919 to 2000 to 1921. 1919 to 1921, Isoroku Tanaka spent 4 years at Harvard University. And he went on to become the commander-in-chief of the Japanese Navy, which of course attacked Pearl Harbor, right? And guess who was in charge of one of the aircraft carriers? We're not going to leave Princeton University out of this conversation. We have Tamon Yamaguchi. He was a rear admiral and in charge of one of the aircraft carriers of the fleet of 6 aircraft carriers that steamed over to Pearl Harbor, Honolulu. And he went to Princeton University for 2 years and 2 months. I'll be specific. March 1921 through May 1923, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi attended Princeton University. You should also know that Yamaguchi and Yamamoto were also invited to the United States Naval War College in 1924. That's right. That's the United States Naval War College. And they also attended the London Naval Conference in 1930. So all of these naval military officers, go to Harvard, Princeton. They go to the War College for the United States Navy. They go to the British War College. And then we have a war where we pretend like they're the enemy and we're the good. But these guys all went out and had drinks together. They're all friends. All the United States admirals know all the Japanese and the German admirals. The whole thing is a simulation. Don't you get it? And Harvard University was home to Al Gore, who was roommates with Tommy Lee Jones. Tommy Lee Jones, who plays Clay Shaw in the JFK Oliver Silverstein movie. Tommy Lee Jones. How inappropriate that. He plays the homosexual Clay Shaw, who's in charge of the trademark in New Orleans and works with Carlos Marcello. Of course, they deleted that from the Oliver Silverstein movie. No mention of Carlos Marcello in that film. And Carlos Marcello is the #1 most important person in New Orleans, a port city for importation of drugs and weapons. And I'm here to tell you that Carlos Marcello was not an American citizen. He's Tunisian. And he was deported by Robert Kennedy to Guatemala in his alligator skin shoes. Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, he went to Harvard. He dropped out, but he went to Harvard and he dropped out. And Jose Menendez's eldest son, Lyle, attended Princeton University for several years until his father got killed, and then that interrupted his Princeton education. And later, it took 6-7 years later, and they convicted him for the murder of his father. It took 2 mistrials before finally, they got a conviction. But the thing is that Lyle Menendez is innocent. He did not kill his father. His father worked for CIA, and the CIA sanctioned his murder, as well as Kitty, the mother. And we have Jeff Skilling and Jane Fraser getting MBAs from the Harvard Business School. Both of them then worked at McKinsey Consulting Company. And Jeff Skilling, of course, became a criminal and CEO of Enron Corporation. And they went to Harvard. Isn't that lovely? What a lovely school. Harvard University, home to felons. I wonder if Jay Fraser is nervous about possibly getting indicted at some point. She's the CEO of Citigroup, which absorbed Franklin National Bank's 5 Sicilian crime families of New York's accounts. I wonder if there's any money laundering going on over there at Citigroup. I'll bet there is. I'll bet there is. I was going to read you something about Harvard MBA program. I happen to personally know some Harvard MBAs, and I'm not impressed. Anyway, Harry Truman did not have a college degree at all. Lyndon Baines Johnson graduated Southwest Texas Teachers College. Richard Nixon got his undergraduate degree at Whittier College. And of course, Ronald Reagan, the professional actor and president of the Screen Actors Guild for 6.5 years. Ronald Reagan graduated from Eureka College in Illinois. And you should know that from 1948 till 1988, only one elected president, John Kennedy, had a degree from an Ivy League school. However, since that happened, since we moved on, since 1988, every single president of the United States has had at least one degree from an Ivy League school. That's kind of disturbing, don't you think? Especially when you see the really poor track record that people who go to Ivy League schools have, at least within clandestine service activities. So to be specific, remember we have Jeff Skilling. He has an MBA from Harvard, and he lived at a federal prison camp in Montgomery, Alabama for a while. He was a longtime inmate there. He was a proud and prominent alumnus of Harvard Business School. John Thain, he was a former brief CEO of Merrill Lynch, which is part of Bank of America. He was going to go to prison, but he skirted his prison sentence, left his position in disgrace after he'd received huge millions of dollars of bonuses as part of the Bank of America merger program. He also had redecorated his office at a preposterous price. You should know that John Thain became a poster child for greedy executives, and yet another example of a disgraced Harvard Business School alumni. Then we have Rajat Gupta, who's former managing director of McKinsey, which was home to Jane Fraser and Jeff Skilling, the consulting firm, the big three. McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, and Bain, the bane of my life. Anyway, Rajat Gupta, who is a graduate of the Harvard Business School, he was released from prison after serving 19 months for insider trading. Obviously, college needs to be more affordable, accessible, and relevant. Yeah, but that's nothing to do with MIT, Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, Yale. Those are indoctrination, clandestine service schools. Not everybody that attends them is selected. Many are called, few are chosen. But the few that are chosen are very well known. Mark Zuckerberg. Dick Cheney. He went to Yale and dropped out. He had a little drinking problem, I understand, along with DUI driving. And we also had Oliver Silverstein Stone. He went to Yale twice, in between teaching kids in Saigon near the U.S. Embassy. I'm assuming those would be CIA children that you're teaching English to. Anyway, Oliver Stone did not graduate from Yale, but he did attend it twice, and his son Sean attended Princeton. That's where William Colby went. That's where Alan Dulles went. That's where John Foster Dulles went. That's where Brooke Shields went. Right? It's a really long list of people that went to Princeton. it's really quite disturbing. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that. So you can look it up for yourself. Harvard, MIT, and Princeton. It's the who's who of people that you've heard of, and you're not particularly happy about it. Anyway, Patrice Lumumba, he did the Fidel Castro tour 1 year later in 1960. He came to New York City and he met with John Kennedy. And then you know that that Patrice Lumumba was killed by the clandestine services in the Congo. Their first democratically elected leader, who was murdered within 6 months of taking his oath of office. And Jack Kennedy, of course, was murdered within 33 and a half months of taking his oath of office. Anyway, if you haven't had a chance to listen to the Waldorf Astoria speech on April 27th, 1961, please do so. It's a stunning speech. You'll never hear anything like that coming out of Ron DeSantis or Gavin Newsom. You're not going to hear anything like that out of Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. All right? Thanks for listening. Have a great day. We'll talk soon. Bye-bye now.